FanScape, a fan fiction podcast, presents Blood and Venom Part 2, Shattered Reality. Chapter 9, Ensnared in Shadow.
Charlie, back off.
The man on the screen stammered, grabbing a nearby chair and raising it in self-defense as the decaying ghoul bore down on him. Lauren could only watch in stunned silence as the fallen camera continued to record the horrific events of that fateful night.
That's your name.
Her heart pounding as she witnessed her friend plead with the corrupted child, appealing to what was left of his humanity. It almost seemed like it was going to work. But then, the screen flickered with a familiar burst of static, and the ghoul attacked, resulting in a scuffle that sent both of them crashing through a window. She couldn't see what happened next, for the tape only showed an empty room, but she could hear the sound of a car starting up and speeding off into the distance as a horrible shriek rang out in the night. It was then that the suited man appeared, calmly strolling towards the abandoned device as corruption overtook the footage. The last thing the camcorder recorded was a pale, clammy hand reaching for it before the screen went black and the video ended. With trembling hands, Lauren removed the tape from the VCR, placed it back by the folder, and took a few moments to collect her thoughts. Nursing a headache as the horrors she'd witnessed burned themselves into her mind. Wordlessly, she looked over the printed email again, wondering why Carl had written about his experience on the farm like it was no big deal. Nothing in that message came close to describing the hell he'd gone through there, and the only thing she could chalk it up to was him still being in shock at the time. There was also no indication of what happened after Carl's escape from the farm, how he'd gotten the camera back, or even a statement about how he was doing. No explanation, no hints, nothing. Lauren had no way of knowing it, but these were the exact reasons that Kate had dismissed the footage as fake so long ago, before she'd met the faceless demon in the ruins of Riverview Park. Once again, her best guess was that he'd been so shaken up that he'd simply forgotten to include these details in his haste to warn Kate about what was coming. As far as that matter went, Lauren was relieved that Carl wasn't the reason for the suited man targeting her and Kate, even if he had gotten himself caught up in the nightmare. But she was still coming to terms with the fact that her best friend's bloodline was being systematically eradicated by a monster with a century-old grudge. A monster that she now knew for certain had wiped out the majority of two families, had been haunting the town of Oakside for over a century, was actively tormenting two of her childhood friends, and was responsible for mutating an innocent child into a subservient monstrosity. At long last, she understood why the Madisons were at the epicenter of everything. This virus had originated with them. Frida's stupidity had doomed two entire families to terrible fates, and Oakside as a whole was also paying the price for her folly.
Way to go, Frida.
She muttered. Even if the woman's spirit had helped Carl escape certain death, she hadn't come anywhere close to redeeming herself in Lauren's eyes. Everything that had happened to her, all that her friends had been forced to go through, the suffering that the Madisons and Hayes families had endured, it was all Frida's fault, and that wasn't something that she was going to forgive so easily. She found herself thinking back to the drawing of the suited man, or Der Grossman, as the storybook referred to it, that she found in the burned house. She'd forgotten all about it until she'd seen Charlie's other drawings appear on that tape, just as she'd forgotten that Charlie had been carrying his teddy bear in the train segments when he was taken. They were such insignificant details in the grand scheme of things, and yet here they were, helping both her and Carl piece together a mystery that no one else had been able to. As for Charlie himself, Lauren had been wondering if the ghoulish creature he'd become was a servant of the suited man ever since she'd met the collective in the Chaser. And now it seemed that she had her answer. She'd initially dismissed the theory due to the corrupted boy begging her for death when they'd crossed paths in that house, only lashing out when she'd refused to kill him. However, She'd come to realize that the collective were the only members of her enemy's horde that enjoyed their work, with the exception of Firebrand, who she knew next to nothing about. The others, such as Charlie and the Chaser, were slaves to the will of an unholy power, only the former of whom was even aware of his own suffering, let alone capable of conscious thought. However, of all the things she learned from Carl's makeshift documentary, the one that surprised her the most was the reality warping abilities of the eye symbol, the exact same sigil that had trapped her inside of Oakside Park. She could hardly believe that something as outlandish and primitive as a supernatural rune was able to channel such terrible power, and the more she pondered its meaning, the more she wondered what else it was capable of. Lauren wished the folder still contained those documents that Carl had mentioned sending, as she would have liked to look over them herself. Her friend had done a pretty good job of narrating his expedition, even going the extra mile by reading most of the important documents out loud for the camera. But the one thing he'd left out in his haste to escape the farm was the lengthy storybook entry about the suited man. The only portion of it she'd been able to make out in the video was the name Derek Grossman, written above the illustration of the beast, and she couldn't help but wonder what information the book held on the creature. A great detail of it was probably exaggerated folklore, but she was confident that, like most legends, the story of Derek Grossman contained a few grains of truth, and maybe a method of fighting or even killing the faceless abomination. The more she thought about the passage, the more she wondered how many different names and identities the beast had earned itself over the years. She was correct in her assumption that it had been around for a very long time and was much older than the German folklore attributed to it. But despite her best attempts at guessing, she couldn't hope to fathom just how old it truly was, let alone the full extent of its dark deeds.
This thing must be a petty son of a bitch to target 2 whole bloodlines because of what one person did.
Lauren thought to herself, wondering just how much of the Matheson and Hayes families had been wiped out by the vengeful monster. She was sure that Kate had never known of her family's involvement in any of this until Carl revealed the truth to her. And she sincerely doubted that Beth had ever known at all, considering her health had started failing around that time, and Kate wouldn't have wanted to place another burden on her.
Wait a minute. Carl said in the tape that it was September of 2007, and Beth got sick the same year, not long after what happened on the farm.
Lauren said, a chilling realization washing over her.
Kate would have seen the footage by then, and if that thing waited until she knew about it to start targeting her...
She could feel her heart pounding as anger welled up inside of her, and her fists clenched as she realized what it all meant. She remembered how Beth's condition had gotten drastically worse after what had happened to Kate in Riverview, how similar her sickness was to the mysterious disease that had taken the life of her husband, John Milens, leaving her a widow and their daughter without a father at only 3 years old. The few details Lauren could remember about their ailments were strikingly similar to what Carl had gone through in the chapel when he'd been confronted by the suited man, as well as what she herself had felt while in the monster's presence. When she took that into account, with how the demon had been hunting through bloodlines...
That filthy bastard!
She growled through gritted teeth.
It wasn't some rare disease that killed John and Beth. It was him!
Lauren had to take deep breaths to calm herself as she processed this foul revelation, her fingernails digging into her shaking hands. She was seeing red, and in that moment, she wanted nothing more than to break that locked door down, find the suited monster, and kill it with her bare hands. But that wasn't possible, and she knew it. She needed something to take her mind off of her fury before she did something stupid. And her gaze fell upon the oddly labeled tape that was laying on the table only a few feet away from Carl's grim memento. She snatched it off the table and crammed it into the VCR a little more forcefully than she'd meant to, her breath catching in her throat as the image of her best friend sitting in a dark room appeared on screen. Thunder crashed and branches snapped as the storm outside continued its assault on the town of Oakside, sending many unsuspecting residents into a blind panic as the ruckus jolted them awake. While her fellow townspeople found the deluge to be an annoyance at best, the sound of heavy rain pelting the roof of her house while relentless wind swept through the trees was rather soothing to Kate. The distracting racket was a nice change of pace from the silence that usually allowed her mind to run wild whenever she indulged in her unusual habit. Sketching those strange illustrations of cryptic phrases and tall trees, accompanied by the suited specter, not unlike the very same notes she'd been forced to retrieve those 8 long years ago. The walls of her room were plastered with the sketches, the floor was littered with the ones she hadn't strung up, and even bare sections of the walls had been used as canvas when a project became too large for paper alone to handle. An obsession such as this was one that formed over almost a decade of being hounded by paranormal entities. Inasmuch as she hated to admit it, she couldn't deny that her self-isolation from society had helped fuel the fires of her strange addiction. With each passing day, more and more of her time was taken up by this fixation, and as a result, she spent more and more time alone in her house. But Kate had decided long ago that that was better for everyone. The fewer people she came into contact with, the lower the risk of someone else getting involved in her predicament. Carl was the only one she'd allowed herself to have regular contact with, for he was in the same sinking vessel that she was and lived by a similar code. They were both infected with a virus that they couldn't hope to fight, suppress, or even run from anymore. And because of that, they only had each other to rely on for many years. Until one day, things had started to get better for her. The nightmares decreased in frequency. She hardly ever saw her supernatural tormentors anymore, and she began to think that they'd lost interest in her. She started to feel like a normal person again, someone who could live a regular life, so much so that when her childhood friend Lauren reached out to her after years of silence in an attempt to rekindle their friendship, she barely hesitated to pick up where they left off, despite Carl's warnings that it would only bring more trouble. Thanks to Lauren, a few months went by where Kate could genuinely say that she felt happy. So happy that she'd agreed to let her friend come all the way to Oakside for a visit. Despite the nagging voice in the back of her head telling her it was a bad idea, for the first time in 8 years, she'd felt like her life was going well. Her problems were dissipating, she'd finally managed to land a decent job, and her childhood best friend was going to be stopping by for a long overdue visit, not to mention helping her sell a house that was much too secluded for the sake of her mental health. However, this brief spell of happiness wasn't to last, and sure enough, Carl's predictions ended up coming true. The enemy came back with a vengeance mere hours after Lauren began her journey to Oakside, targeting Carl like it never had before. And by some miracle, he was able to survive its attack and send a message to Kate that told very little, but was enough to get her up and moving. By the time she met with him and learned what was happening, it was too late for either of them to warn Lauren to turn back. For the beast had begun its hunt, and its influence was blocking all forms of outside communication. Both of them could only pray that Lauren wouldn't get caught in the crossfire as they made their way to the radio station high up in the mountain range, a place that Carl had been referring to as a means to an end for weeks. He'd refused to tell her what he meant by that, but Kate had hoped that he'd found a way to hide or even fight back against the administrator, and that the station was where they could do just that. All of his talk about the place had made her see it as a safe haven, an oasis in a desert of misery, so much so that the radio tower had worked its way into her cryptic artwork. Looking back on it, she couldn't have been more wrong. Carl's solution to the problem was not what she'd been expecting in the slightest. And hours later, she could still picture the traumatic things she'd witnessed there, as if she was watching them play out in front of her. So many times in the past, she hadn't trusted Carl's judgment, beginning with the events of his farm expedition and the truth of her family's history. Time and time again, it turned out poorly for her. So it was a cruel irony that the one time that she decided to listen to him was the one time that she shouldn't have. Kate felt tears run down her face as she thought back to what had happened in the radio station only a few hours before the storm began. Even now, she could see the ominous red glow of the radio tower from the window in her bedroom, a constant reminder of her failure.
He's still up there,
she thought, staring at the beacon of false hope as memories of the event tightened their grip on her. She couldn't even explain how she'd managed to make it out of that situation alive. Everything had been pitch black in that network of narrow hallways. The only light coming from behind her as she fled the scene of Carl's last-ditch plan. She remembered trying to keep a small flame going as she stumbled through the darkness, tripping over debris and dropping her lighter as something unseen closed in on her, sprinting to a heavy door and throwing it open. Then, inexplicably standing in front of her house after being blinded by a flash of light. The only explanation she could come up with for the extraordinary circumstances of her survival was that her friend from the other side had finally returned to help after so many years of absence. But even if that was true, his deus ex machina may have come too late to do much more than delay the inevitable. She hadn't bothered to get undressed or shower when she'd found herself back at home, simply heading up to her room and collapsing in bed instead. She still wore the dirty red shirt, torn blue jeans, and dark gray shoes that she'd had on throughout her journey to and from the radio station, lacking the motivation to change into something clean after the horrors she'd witnessed there. The longer the storm went on, the more she enjoyed listening to it. The howling wind and buckets of rain helped clear her head, and the metallic creaking of the swing set outside, accompanied by the sound of groaning trees, only added to the soothing atmosphere. Perhaps the reason she could hear it so well was that earlier in the day, she'd opened all the windows and doors in her house, hoping to counteract the unusual heat wave that came just before the storm. Part of her knew that she should have shut them, but at this point, Kate simply didn't care. It was an unusually warm night. The breeze felt good, and the sound and smell of the rain helped ease her conscience. However, as the hours passed, the storm had steadily grown worse, and despite how soothing she may have found it, she was still aware of what it meant. She'd seen the administrator cause atmospheric disturbances before, but never anything of this magnitude. The entire town was feeling his wrath, but she felt a strange sense of relief knowing that fact. The sheer intensity of the deluge may have turned her into a prisoner in her own home, but it also was keeping Lauren away from what was about to happen, and for that, she was grateful. It was late in the night now, around 3:30 a.m., and the only light in her room came from the flashlight laying on her bed, as the storm had knocked the power out hours ago. She'd set up her camcorder next to the flashlight and was using it to record herself, another habit that stemmed from dealing with entities that nobody else could see. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind blew through the open windows, sweeping through the scattered paper and knocking a few from the walls. Then, lightning flashed across the sky, accompanied by an ear-splitting crack of thunder, and Kate froze on the spot, feeling an all-too-familiar chill creeping up her spine. She turned to face the camera, her long black hair hanging in her face, her stormy gray eyes full of terror, and whispered,
"He's here."
She quickly gathered the equipment laying on her bed, requiring the flashlight to see more than 5 feet in front of her. She held her camera close, listening for audio distortion to know when her enemy was drawing near. She had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and she knew it. Her time was almost up, but she wasn't going down without a fight.
"Close all the windows and doors,"
Kate whispered to herself, running to her bedroom window and slamming it shut.
"Just don't let them in."
She was well aware that the administrator and his collective wouldn't be hindered by locked doors or closed windows, but she'd seen his lesser minions before. Those snarling, shrieking, soulless beasts that used to be people, and she wasn't about to let those things get anywhere near her if she could help it.
"Why didn't I think of that earlier?"
She berated herself, snatching a white hoodie off her desk chair, throwing it on and zipping it up, then dashing out into the hallway and shutting the window next to her bedroom door. The air that had been warm only moments before was now so frigid that she could see her own breath, and it felt like her entire body was freezing over, as if any remaining happiness had been drained from her world. She knew this feeling. It was one she felt only once before, back in Riverview Park. It meant the enemy had her in his sights, and something told her that he had no intention of letting her escape this time around. Her skin began to crawl as she realized how unnaturally silent everything other than the storm was, and her heart pounded in her chest and her breathing became raspy as fear slowly replaced the adrenaline in her system. This was it, her final stand against the administrator, and as brave as she tried to be, as defiant a death as she wanted to have, she felt nothing but terror. She wished all the calls that she'd made to Lauren telling her not to come over anymore would have gone through, but no matter how hard she tried, she'd been unable to stop her friend from rushing headlong into this nightmare. She prayed that it would all be over by the time she reached her destination, that she would never have to face the evil that had destroyed the lives of her friends. But she had no way of knowing for sure that her best friend would be safe, and for that she felt as guilty as she was terrified. As she ran from room to room, fortifying her home, Kate was reminded of the fact that she'd torn the entire house apart during a mental breakdown after what happened in the radio station. She hoped that if her friend still made it to her home after the storm blew over, she would have enough sense to flee after seeing the place abandoned and in shambles.
Whatever you do, Lauren, don't try to find me. And please, please don't get anyone else involved. Let this plague die with me.
Kate thought to herself. She was well aware of the guilt that Lauren felt for the two of them growing apart, and now she wished that she would have done more to ease her friend's conscience. Never once had she blamed Lauren for the distance that formed between them, for Kate had intentionally let it happen in order to keep her safe. However, that very separation and the undeserved guilt that Lauren carried because of it was something that made Kate fear for her friend's safety, for it was something that could very well lead her down a path not bargained. Stabbing back to reality, she finished securing the upstairs and raced down the staircase, heading towards the open door. As terrified as she wasn't able to resist taking a look outside, and regretted it as soon as she did. The wind howled, the rain came down in buckets, entire branches fell from trees, and bolts of lightning streaked across the dark sky. It was when a particularly bright flash of lightning lit up her yard and illuminated the tall, suited figure looking back at her from the tree line, its dark tendrils hanging in the air around it, that Kate's blood ran cold. She slammed and locked the door before returning to her objective.
Don't go outside. He's out there.
She whispered, racing through the house with her flashlight's dim beam serving as her only guide. Then, as she was shutting the last few windows and doors, an eerie song accompanied by white noise began playing from her radio, despite the power outage. It was a chilling tune that she'd never heard before, one that made her flesh crawl as she stood there listening to it in the darkness. She shivered as the haunting tune echoed throughout the house. Doing her best to ignore it, Kate wasn't about to go running over to the room with the radio in it to shut it off, as she suspected that the music was meant to lure her into a trap. She tried to focus on the sound of the storm, on the wind chimes crashing together loudly in the tempest, anything but that eerie song. She found herself thinking back to a similar situation, one that occurred at the very beginning of her descent into perdition, all the way back in 2009, only with disembodied whispers instead of music. Locking the last window, she made her way back over to the staircase and took a seat on the bottom step, right next to where she discarded her backpack earlier. She knew that she couldn't fight the demon, that she couldn't run from it anymore, and that there was nowhere left for her to hide. Her house was as secure as she could make it, and there was nothing left for her to do but wait and see what happened next. Kate found herself gazing at the fresh drawings on the wall, wondering what had possessed her to sketch them in such an inconvenient place. It was as she sat there waiting for something to happen that the grim tune pierced her thoughts once again. With a thunderous crash, the front door burst open with such force that a nearby shelf broke and a few pictures were sent tumbling from the walls. Kate jumped to her feet and backed up a few steps, trembling with fear. Looming in the doorway was the administrator, reaching his hand out and beckoning her to come forward as he ducked into the house.
Come along, Caitlin. We have delayed this for long enough. Wouldn't you agree?
It was in that moment that she realized she wasn't about to die. No, a fate worse than death was in store for her. A fate that countless others had suffered before. Kate had seen what became of Charlie Masson, what had become of the other poor souls enthralled by the demon, and she found death to be a preferable alternative.
No!
She shouted, throwing a fallen picture frame at the faceless abomination and bolting up the stairs.
I need to hide.
She whispered, sprinting towards her bedroom.
No, I need to get out of this house.
When she finally reached her last remaining place of sanctuary, she slammed the door shut and locked herself inside. Tears began to flow as she walked towards the window, hugging her arms tight to her chest to keep warm. Watching the rain run down the glass, she knew she had a choice to make. A jump from this height could easily kill her. And even if she survived it, there was no guarantee that she would be able to get back up off the ground and flee her pursuer. But she had no other choice. It was either a leap of faith or the horrible fate that the suited demon had in store for her. And she knew which one she preferred. It was as she was beginning to unlatch the window that she heard the bedroom door quietly unlocking itself behind her. And terror filled her heart as she heard the door slowly creak open. Kate shrieked in terror as several ice-cold tendrils shot through the gap in the door and wrapped around her limbs and neck, lifting her into the air and bringing her face to face with the administrator as he calmly strode into the room. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She could only watch in paralyzed horror as the demon examined the prey it had waited so patiently to capture.
I told you long ago that I had plans for you, Kate. And for 8 years I have allowed you to live your life as you saw fit. But now, the bill has come due.
With those words, it threw its victim backwards and she let out a scream as she crashed through the bedroom window. Kate was dimly aware of shattered glass cutting her flesh as she tumbled through the air, the ground quickly rushing up to meet her. Then, she hit the dirt hard and laid there, beaten and battered in the soaking wet grass, unmoving, unresponsive. Her camera had fallen with her, hitting the ground and recording the comatose woman as she lay there, motionless in the mud and rain. It was then that the administrator appeared once more, standing over her broken form as the camera's audio and video quality deteriorated by the second. His black tentacles writhed in the air around him as lightning flashed and thunder boomed, the storm showing no signs of letting up. As the camera finally began to flicker off, it picked up one last image before everything went black. A dark, heavily distorted screen showing the suited man's featureless face and nothing more. A static screeching sound playing over it before the video abruptly ended. Thank you for listening to Blood and Venom, written by Arthur Faraday, under the username WoodMr13. Distributed on Archive of Our Own. Season 2 of FanScape has been funded by the Nevada Arts Council and the National Endowment of the Arts. Starring Aubrey Lima as Lauren Jones and young Charlie, Cathryn Archer as Kate Milens, David Klein II as the narrator, Xander Grant as Carl Ross, Chris McConaughey as the Slender Man. Guest starring Harlan Guthrie as the introduction narrator. Intro and credits music created by Dylan Griggs. This episode features a cover of Oh Willow Whaley, covered by Lauren Paley. Special thanks to our fellow podcasting friends who have helped make Season 2 possible at Malevolent, Through the Fog, The Impala Films, creators of Haunted and audio drama, Woe Begone, The Morbid Forest, and our friends at World Beyond and Jabun Audio. Before we end the episode, I just want to take a moment to say that while Season 2 of FanScape was funded by a grant, future seasons will be done so out of pocket. This show has a high production cost, and any assistance you can give, be it by sharing FanScape with a friend, or by joining our Patreon or Ko-Fi, or even buying merch to help fund the show financially, would be greatly appreciated and will help make Season 3 come sooner rather than later. Links for this and everything else mentioned in the credits can be found in the description or at thefanscape.com. Thank you for listening.